Welcome back to Lush Life. I hope everyone had a wonderful holiday. We swing back into action with a guest who was always the guy at the office who was doing whiskey tastings. I had no idea that position even existed. I'm Susan Schwartz, your drinking companion, and this is Lush Life Podcast. Every week we are inspired to live life one cocktail at a time by the best in the industry. Whiskey was Thomas Mooney, the co-founder of Westward Whiskey's drink of choice. So much so that he really was the guy who arranged whiskey tastings at the office. He thought one day he would retire and then have a whiskey distillery. But that dream became a reality sooner than he thought. But before you hear that story, I know it's dry January for some of you. But for the others, you're thinking to yourselves, what tour can grant me access to some of the most famous bars and bartenders in London, all while sipping their celebrated cocktails and learning about Soho's drinking history? Just head over to lushlifecocktailtours.com to buy your ticket to the tastiest tour in London. Oh, and for all of you spending January dry, every bar will make a non-alcoholic beverage for your drinking pleasure as well. Now, back to Tom.
I grew up in Guatemala.
That's a surprise.
Which is, it's like you meet someone named Thomas Mooney, obviously you think they grew up in Guatemala.
Especially with your accent.
Exactly, especially.
So were you born there?
I was. My dad was American, but moved there in 1960 and met my mom while he was there and stayed and started a business and never left. So I grew up there. I lived there until I went to university.
What kind of business was it?
A lending business. It was a really cool, he would lend to non-traditional agricultural growers who couldn't borrow from banks because they were doing things that were a little riskier or more speculative. And so it helped actually.
He was way before his time.
Micro
lending and all that.
Where is he now for my business? We can't borrow from banks, but we could have borrowed from them. And so, it was part of transforming the economy of Guatemala from a very traditional sort of coffee growing economy to higher yield, sort of better wage crops. It was a really cool business.
Fantastic. Were there lots of Americans around?
No. In fact, I went to the American school where I was one of only 3 U.S. citizens in my class of about 100. So no, it wasn't. There wasn't a really big expat population. Of Americans or people from anywhere else.
That is so cool. And so when did you say that you moved to the States?
I moved to the United States in 1988 to go to university at Purdue in Indiana. And I lived in Guatemala until then.
So what was it like? Your first kind of weeks in Indiana?
It was different. I grew up in a fairly large city. Purdue is in West Lafayette, which is a small town in northwest Indiana. So I think there was an adjustment process to being, in a much smaller place. At the same time, I was 18 and sharing a small town with 30,000 other kids my age in college.
Away from the parents,
Yeah, so it was fun. It was too much fun.
Well, do you remember, I'm sure you do, kind of the drinking culture in Guatemala? When you were, I'm sure there was no drinking age, at least not like 21.
Yeah, when I was growing up in Guatemala, there was a drinking age. It was 18. There was also no enforcement of it. And in fact, culturally, that drinking age wasn't really a factor.
That's what I meant.
Guatemala is like many places in Latin America where, for example, girls, when they turn 15, have a big party. So I guess in the U.S. it's Sweet 16, and in Latin America it's Quinceañera, which is 15 years old. And so we would go to parties that were hosted by the families, and you wear a suit. It's a formal ball. It's a very civilized affair. But you're 15 years old and you're sitting at a table where there's a bottle of Johnny Walker Black that's there for you to enjoy with your friends.
Whiskey.
That was served
Whiskey.
by the girl's parents. Which in hindsight seems really bizarre. I mean, I'm a whiskey maker and I'm all for people enjoying whiskey. But I now have a son who's 14 and I have no plans of serving him a bottle of Westward Whiskey when he turns 15. So I don't want anybody else doing that either. But yeah, it was different then. And it was, I mean, in terms of what people enjoyed, it was both a rum and a malt whiskey culture. And so those were really the two kind of staple spirits, which obviously are very different from each other, but I think more depending on the occasion. Sometimes people drank rum, sometimes people drank scotch.
Did you miss it when you went to university?
Well, I don't know anybody who's ever been to university who couldn't find alcohol if that's what they were looking for.
Of course.
So I think what was shocking to me was, I mean, not unlike sort of prohibition, right? That when you take something that is acceptable culturally and you make it illegal, then you create a black market and all sorts of really bizarre behavior. So, I mean, there was alcohol everywhere. And I mean, in any other country, we would have been old enough to buy it and enjoy it.
Right.
But yeah, it just...
Well, listen, my dad, he's not going to get in trouble now, I don't think, but he used to buy us jugs of Kahlua and beer.
Yeah, okay. So if we're going there, yes, my dad would come to visit, and he was the most popular dad at my dorm because we would go to the 21st Amendment liquor store in Lafayette and stock up because that's when we could do it.
I guess we had good dads in our eyes, but so...
I know I did.
I know I did too. Now that level of whiskey, I guess, was kind of put aside as you went through university, and what were you studying there?
Well, no, I was always the weirdo in college who liked scotch. So, I mean, I never stopped liking it.
Sorry, excuse my assumption.
Yeah, if anything, sort of college introduced beer to my life because. As strange as it sounds, beer was very, very expensive in Guatemala. So young people didn't drink beer. It was like too premium. And I mean, you could get a decent bottle of rum for, about $2 or £2. And it probably would have cost 5 times that to buy a 6-pack of beer. So yeah, beer wasn't a thing. It was in college. They had beer. So
you obviously didn't study beer drinking in college. So what did you go there to study?
Yeah, well, I went there to learn how to be a whiskey distiller in the future. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. I got a degree in engineering and in industrial engineering specifically. So a lot of things related to manufacturing and the science of developing things and producing them.
So where did you go from there after college?
I did not go into engineering. And so at that point I thought, I really enjoyed engineering school, but I thought I was done with technical things and making things. And so my first job out of college was with Procter & Gamble in marketing or brand management. So one of my sisters worked at P&G, and I knew she was really happy, and I sort of approached the company and met with them first in Cincinnati at their headquarters, and then ended up getting an offer and being given the choice of either working in Cincinnati or going back to Latin America with the company, but to a very different kind of experience. Cincinnati would have been very established, very corporate, more of a one step at a time kind of career progression. They offered me the opportunity to go back to Guatemala, where I had grown up, and where P&G had entered the market only 3 years before that. So it was within a $30 billion global company. It was a startup subsidiary and a completely different environment. I mean, something nobody could have ever walked in there and thought, this is one of the largest companies in the world, which I really enjoyed. So it was a lot of fun. I chose wisely.
And what kind of things were you doing marketing for?
My very first assignment was to start up P&G's laundry detergent business in all of Central America. So it was so awesome. It was fun career-wise because that's P&G's biggest business, and not many people ever get to start P&G's biggest business in the country.
Right.
There are only so many countries, and there are only so many
to be
times.
so young doing this.
Yeah, well, the good news is I was so young that I didn't know what I didn't know. So I wasn't inhibited by my lack of experience or knowledge, because when you're 22, you're immortal and infallible.
And super enthusiastic.
Yeah. So that was kind of cool because we didn't really have market research or any sort of classic kind of information that you would base a launch strategy on or a marketing strategy on. So it was just to kind of roll your sleeves up and go learn about the market. It seems kind of funny, but Guatemala so there are two kinds of laundry detergent markets in the world. You have machine wash and hand wash markets.
Okay.
And they're vastly different behaviorally, and the products are very different for the two. So Guatemala is a hand wash, like very traditional market. I spent many hours of many days like in a river talking to ladies doing the wash for their towns, like just finding out what they need in a laundry detergent and how they do things. Mm-hmm. And so it was really cool because it was really connecting with the most traditional part of sort of culture in Guatemala and then other parts of Central America, to bring a product that seems it's so mundane in developed countries that you don't even think about it. You go to the store, you buy it, you put it in the machine, your clothes are clean. Like this is a big part of life in a lot of countries, is making clothes clean.
I love it.
And it's a huge part of sort of where people's self-esteem comes from, of having clothes that look nice, that are clean. And so that was really the biggest insight, is we weren't selling a stain removal product. We were offering something that helped people have more self-esteem because they had nicer things that looked better, and so they felt better.
And so you obviously took to marketing.
Yeah, it was fun. I'd never worked in marketing in my life, and it was a ton of fun.
So did you just want to stay in Guatemala forever? What took you back to the U.S.?
Well, not unlike, my dad moved to Guatemala for what he thought was going to be a brief period of time, met my mother, who's from there, and stayed. At P&G, I met my wife, now of almost 25 years, who also worked at P&G, but she was in Colombia, in Bogota. And we worked together on a project, and then within a year we were married. And so one of us was going to move to the other one's country, and I was offered a really nice opportunity to grow within P&G by moving to Colombia. So I moved there. And so we lived in Bogota for almost 2 years. And then at that point, an opportunity came up to move to the United States to work at Kellogg in Michigan for both of us. So we both moved, and that's when we first went to the United States. So
was it tough leaving
97.
South America?
No. I lived my whole life minus, 4 years in Indiana in Latin America. And it was formative, but I was ready to do something different too.
On to the next adventure.
Yeah. So I think it was more exciting than difficult.
So what product did you move move to after living with detergent?
At Kellogg. Once you've done detergents, nothing ever,
you can never go back.
Yeah, you can never reach that level of excitement. At Kellogg, I worked on an innovation team. So it was new product development, really across a range of food categories. So it was not big brands that already, existed or were known, but it was creating the brands of the future. A lot of it was very technical because, food is, we often don't think about that, but It was developing new types of food or finding ways to make food more nutritious. So there was a big food science part of it, but then that none of that matters if you can't market it. So a big marketing component as well. Mm-hmm. And I think in marketing, the most complete discipline of all is new product development, because you have to deal with everything from the original idea to design, to overcoming technology barriers or production barriers, to finding ways to make things at a good cost, all the way to then telling the world that they should really want something that until yesterday they didn't even know existed, and now they must have it. So it really is the whole gamut of from idea to making something part of people's lives.
Did you do that for any specific beverage? Had you moved into the drinks yet?
No. My drinks industry experience would come still a few years in the future. This was all food.
All food. Mm-hmm. And then where did you go from there after Kellogg?
I went to business school at Harvard, and so I was there from 1999 to 2001. It was the greatest experience ever. It was so much fun.
Did you think that you were going to continue in marketing there?
I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. And I mean, candidly, the way business school applications work, they ask you questions that demand that you precisely know what you're going to do the rest of your life. But I don't think anybody really goes to business school if they have that answer. Because if you have that answer, then you would just go do the thing you said you're going to do and save yourself a lot of money.
Make whiskey, right?
Right. So yes, had I had the foresight, then I could have saved a lot of money. But no, I mean, being at Harvard was one of the great experiences of my life, and specific. I mean, the friends I made who are still there's almost no city I go to in the world where there isn't somebody I can write to before going there and saying, hey, I'm going to be there this week. I'm going to be in London the week of December 2nd. I'd love to see you. I have 14 classmates in London, and, whenever we can get together, we do. So it really is, it was a 2-year wonderful experience, but a whole lifetime of being part of a community that is really fun to stay connected with.
Do you think that when you came out of it, you wanted to stay in the corporate world, or do you think it taught you a little bit more entrepreneurial skills?
I was always, I don't know if I realized it at the time, but I was always headed toward more entrepreneurial lands. I realized every place I've ever worked was smaller than the last place I worked. And I've never in my life...
Who would say PG to Kellogg?
I've never had a situation where I went to work at a place that's bigger than any place I ever used to be. And so, that's now clear to me at my age, but as it was happening, it wasn't really that clear. I left business school to go to a consulting firm, and I did some management consulting work for about 2 years. I left that to go work for what was at that time an agricultural company in Los Angeles called Roll International, that then changed its name to Roll Global, that then changed its name to The Wonderful Company. But it was primarily a husband and wife owned family that grew almonds and pistachios in California. And the reason I went to work for them was a sort of internal strategy group that they had where I could bring a lot of the experience I had and work with different parts of their company. And I mean, it was just really salt of the earth, agricultural business. And then one day, which I guess in hindsight changed my life, but I didn't realize it at the time. The couple who owns this company met the founder of Fiji Water. And his name was David Gilmore. And David was ready to sell Fiji Water, and he didn't want to sell it to a large company. And so he got Linda and Stuart Resnick, who I worked for, interested in Fiji. And because of the role I had with their company, I ended up working on, the due diligence and ultimate deal team to help them buy the company. And then after that, I was the first person from sort of the acquiring company to move over to Fiji as the chief marketing officer. And so I spent the next 5 years or so as the head of marketing for Fiji, and then also sort of worked in some sales roles in that. And that was really my first experience in the beverage industry. And I think the most formative professional experience I've ever had. I mean, I was mentioning to someone this week, there literally is not a day that goes by that I don't use something I learned in those 5 years, or that I'm not working with someone who I met or worked with during those 5 years. So that really was the beginning of everything that that has followed through Westward Whiskey today.
And while you were gaining all of this experience, were you still drinking whiskey? How did your whiskey loving evolve?
Oh, heck yeah. I was always the guy at the office who would do the whiskey tastings because people loved whiskey in general, but didn't really have the time or inclination to go educate themselves on it.
By the way, I love how you said that, because I don't know any other office where there's a guy doing whiskey tasting. Like, you're the guy at the office.
I thought there was a guy at every office. Or,
there isn't.
Or not a guy.
They are lucky, wherever you worked. That company was lucky. They had a guy who did the whiskey tasting.
Yeah, I guess since I've always worked in an office that has a guy who does the whiskey tastings.
Because you were that guy.
I thought everybody had.
All right, no. So how did you know which whiskeys to choose? Was it different every week? How often did you do these whiskey tastings? I want to know everything.
I think we probably did something every month. Very heavily oriented toward malt whiskey. Again, because that's what I had grown up with and probably knew the most about. But we'd weave in a few things to like contrast, malts with bourbon. One of my favorite tricks was always to put some cognac in the blind tasting, because people who love whiskey claim that they don't drink cognac, but if you give cognac to most whiskey drinkers, they love it. And so what they have is they think they don't like the category, but they love the products. And so more often than not, somebody's favorite whiskey is cognac.
Well, where would you do research about the whiskeys and the cognacs to choose?
Wherever I could, books, the internet. Okay, I lived at a time when there wasn't the internet. Right?
The books.
That's mind-blowing to my kids. They think the internet was invented in the 1300s.
Of course, Gutenberg's internet.
But there was always the internet. Like, what do you mean there wasn't the internet? Books, friends. But in hindsight, now that I'm a whiskey maker, like I wish I knew then the things I know now. I could have made the tastings even more interesting. Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah. But it was fun.
So now you've got to get to when the worlds collided with you and Christian.
Right. Because I always, as the official guy who does the whiskey tastings at the office, I had this thought that, I'll just keep having normal jobs and eventually save enough money to retire. And then when I do, wouldn't it be cool to be a whiskey distiller? But just as done with a career, it's time to just go do something fun.
And wait, when did you start first thinking that?
Oh, by the time I was at Fiji Water, for sure.
Okay.
That just seemed like a really good plan. They just go. I guess I always thought of whiskey as a very rural thing. So if you had asked me then, I would have imagined like some sort of farm and there's a still and, very...
And they're growing the grain, they have the water, it all happens there, right?
Yeah, that whole thing. Like, who knew you can make whiskey in the city?
Right.
It was always something that was an interest, but I really didn't have a path. Like, okay, so I want to do that, and I know more than the average bear about whiskey, but that doesn't mean I can just go make whiskey. That all changed in 2009 when I met Christian. And so, what had happened leading up to that was, I I mean, as formative and amazing as my Fiji experience was, I felt that, I'd gotten about as much out of it as I was going to, and that, Fiji had gotten about as much as it was going to for me. So it was a good time to think about what's next. And one of my business school friends and classmates was the founder of a tequila company, Milagro. And so he and two university friends had started Milagro, then I guess 10 years before, 15 years before. His name is Arturo Litwack. And so Arturo and I decided, he worked with his family on the real estate business. I was at Fiji. And so we decided it'd be fun to start a business together. And, we had both worked in premium beverages, him with Milagro, me with Fiji. We both felt that we shared an understanding of how to build a luxury drinks brand. We also were convinced that we had no idea how to make anything. So we needed to find somebody who could. And so on a whim, we sent an email to Jim Cook, the founder of Boston Beer, Sam Adams, who went to Harvard Business School. So it was, you can kind of guess people's email address just from the way. It's like, all right, J Cook at MBA, whatever, hvs.edu. So, much to our amazement, he wrote back the same day, yes, I would be happy to talk to you and give you advice, and what kind of business are you guys thinking of starting? So we spoke with Jim for about an hour. He asked us to please stay out of the beer business because there are too many people in it. And he said, yes, I'm being selfish, but I'm just saying, all right, got it. But he was really the first person who pointed us toward craft spirits and said, look, it's not exactly the same situation, but I see things happening in the spirits industry that are very similar to the world when I started Boston Beer. And if that's the way it plays out, there's an opportunity for people who know how to run a business and can really take a great product and scale it and turn it into a great brand. And so what you guys need to do is, go out there, find someone who knows how to make great products in spirits, but they need to be already in business because there needs to be some traction and some evidence that this wasn't, one batch that turned out really nicely, but, this is really somebody who's exceptional at making great products. And it needs to be somebody who wants new partners because they're going to need to let you in and, be part of the business. And so we thought, this is fantastic. We just got the whole playbook. And then we sat and thought about it for a while and realized, okay, so we need to find someone who's already in business, who makes great products with traction, and actually wants us as partners.
Right, wants to work with you, right?
Okay, that sounds like it might be the Venn diagram of zero, but let's give it a shot. And so in 2009, I went to Portland, Oregon, to the Great American Distillers Festival, which at the time, the American craft spirits community was so small that actually most of the craft spirits community was in one ballroom. You could fit it all at the Bossa Nova Ballroom in Portland. And I literally went table to table, just learning about each brand, meeting the founder, talking about sort of their plans. And then I got to Christian's table, and that was the first time we connected. And as it turned out, Christian had for years been making fantastic products. This was 2009, so he had started the original, what was then House Spirits Distillery in 2004, but had been working on it a little bit before that. So he'd been doing this for a while. He was generally regarded as really a luminary in terms of sort of innovation and quality. And he was in the middle of a really bad breakup with his original business partner. So oh my God. So we found someone who's already in business, makes a great product, has a track record, and wants new partners. Mm-hmm. All right, this sounds good. And so we spent the next almost year and a half, talking about working together. And, he didn't want to rush into new partners when, the original partnership hadn't ended well. And we wanted to make sure that this was really the right thing for us and for everybody. And then, more importantly, whatever we did was going to cost more money than we had, so we needed to find some investors to back it. And so it took about a year and a half to really create the framework of all of us as partners and bringing in some outside investment. And so in June of 2011, we finally officially signed all the documents at a restaurant in Portland called Clyde Common that's famous for being one of the innovators of the barrel-aged cocktail. So we figured we could go to our lawyer's office, or we could actually go somewhere fun and spend all afternoon signing documents. So we chose fun.
Now, was Westward already, in the barrel? Was it an idea?
So Westward existed, but it existed in the form of 12 barrels against one wall at the distillery. And that's all there was. We have a really fantastic picture from that era of us and the first two people we hired after that standing in front of our barrels.
Did you, I assume you tasted it?
Oh, yeah. No. And this was part of we found someone who makes a great product.
And you loved it.
The distillery made a few different things, but the whiskey was exceptional. And so it was something that we realized would be a much longer term proposition because, the 12 barrels still needed a little aging, and we were going to need more than 12 barrels to build a brand. But it was really the beginning of, I think, all of us collectively embarking on, this Westward journey. And so we spent the next 3 years making as much whiskey as we could, which meant that we increased our inventory from 12 barrels to 163 barrels.
Super premium.
If you think of what percent growth that is, it's massive. Yeah. And so then we realized, okay, this is in our lifetime, we're never going to build this brand if we're only able to produce this much. Mm-hmm. So in what was, really one of the defining moments for us, we decided to build a new distillery, still in Portland, and we really decided. We wanted something much bigger where we could, increase production to, our target was 1,200 barrels a year. When we'd been making, 1 or 2 barrels on in a good month. Mm-hmm. And so, we went back to our original investor group, and they were excited about the idea. And so we began planning for it in 2013 or maybe early 2014. Eventually built it in 2015 and moved in, and have since been producing. So now we have 4,228 barrels as of yesterday, which it's still there are more barrels than people in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. So it's not like Kentucky is nervous about our growth. Scotland can be reassured as well that we're not going to take anybody out. But we finally have enough product that we can go out to the world and build a brand. So we finally gave it a name 7 years ago. And so Westward, those barrels against the wall became Westward American Single Malt Whiskey at that time. We had so little that we only sold it in our tasting room. And we would put it in really little bottles so that it was, a bad value proposition because, if it had been a good value proposition, we would have run out right away. And then, as we had a little more inventory, we eventually put it in, a full-size bottle. But it really wasn't until 3 years ago that we began to distribute that, and it wasn't until the last year that we finally took Westward outside the U.S. So, for us, we've been on this journey, for a very long time. For most of the world, it feels like, this is something relatively new to the world. Because most people in most places have only finally seen it for the first time over the last year. Mm-hmm. Our sales our sales this year are more than the combined sales of every year going back to the original launch of Westward. So, and next year the same statement will be true. So, So really every year, most people who enjoy Westward will have enjoyed it for the first time because it just wasn't there for them before. So it's exciting because we've had all of these things happening in the background, and we're finally at that point where everything comes out of the shadows, and
you can start screaming about it.
Yeah, and we can really, instead of trying to suppress demand on purpose, which was kind of bizarre, we now there's enough for everybody who wants it. So we can be out there talking about it.
Well, let's talk about the whiskey itself. Mm-hmm. Well, you said you thought up, the name Westward came to be, not at the beginning. Why did you decide on that name?
When we first began thinking about, our whiskey, we wanted to do something that really embodied, our home in the Northwest and the place Westward comes from. And some people know the American Northwest well. Many have not been there or don't fully understand it. It's a majestic place. It's a place that was raised out of the water by giant volcanic eruptions, and that was shaped by the largest floods in prehistoric time. And it has volcanoes that still erupt. One that blew up a few decades ago. Everything about it is big and bold and awesome, and and it's also in terms of human history, with the American West, the destination of the largest migration in history, right? And it was a migration entirely driven by the belief that if you leave everything behind and you go westward, you can go create whatever future you want. It's very inspiring to us because from the very first settlers of the Oregon Territory, then now Oregon, to people who came to Portland last week, people left wherever they came from and went there with a dream, and they've arrived to build something new. And so we felt that spoke to what we were trying to do. And it certainly celebrates, the history of the place where we make whiskey. So the name came from that. Mm-hmm. And really everything else, everything about the product itself, the whiskey itself is that same sort of, celebration of the American Northwest and of Oregon. We make single malt whiskey because barley is our grain. That's what grows in that old Oregon Territory, including, right outside of Portland. It's two-row barley. It's, the highest quality barley in North America that historically had gone into craft beer, is right there. That's what you drive through when you drive across the Northwest. Because Oregon is such a great brewing culture, we have a lot of malting expertise. The malting we work with is less than 5 miles from the distillery. They're spectacular. So we had, our regional grain, we had our local malt, and we went into it with, I would say, a brewer's mentality or philosophy, which people who make beer will understand. It's making great beer is hard. Whiskey sounds super awesome, and wine is so fancy, but making great beer, well, at least we think, and a lot of the people we think, is the hardest thing there is to do. And we don't just make a wash to distill into our whiskey. We make an American style craft pale ale that we distill into whiskey. And everything about how we treat the grain that comes in and how we brew it, how we use an ale yeast, the Chico strain, so it's a traditional American pale ale yeast to produce really fruity floral esters and all the things that make a pale ale amazing. We don't put hops in it, but other than that, we're making great pale ale. We're simply doing it for the purpose of distilling into whiskey. And so we'll often talk about what we do as minimalism or minimalist distilling, in that we don't add anything, we don't rush anything. We use great grain, we ferment it slowly, we use more expensive yeast that has a lower yield but produces a lot more flavor. We distill in low reflux pot stills that keep all that great flavor in. It's just, I guess maybe like the slow food equivalent of whiskey making. Just good ingredients, treat them right, take your time. You'll end up with something really bold and flavorful and amazing.
And you've been awarded for this process, so create some delicious whiskey.
Right. We always thought it was pretty good, but we're not objective. So when others agreed with us, it was cause for celebration. So Westward won a double gold medal at the San Francisco World Spirits Competition, the most recent one, making it the highest rated American single malt whiskey. But we think it's even more than that. We think it is. One, I think we really nailed it in terms of creating this whiskey of the elements of the American Northwest and something that brings to life, the culture and people and climate of where we make the whiskey. But also, it's delicious. Which ultimately, whiskey shouldn't feel like hard work. We always remember that, while we're aware of how much effort and how much time it took for something to end up in a bottle, the person who's going to love it is at the other end of the spectrum. It's time to wind down from, their own version of what they've worked really hard for and have struggled for. And now it's time for them to celebrate, their day with a little glass of Westward.
Well, that sounds like a good idea.
Keep it fun.
It sounds like a good idea to me.
You should try it sometime.
Should we go have a sip, I hope? All right, let's have a drink.
After the interview, Tom was telling me about the new Westward Whiskey expressions that you can only get at the distillery in Portland. I knew you'd want to hear this.
So are you playing with any other expressions of your whiskeys?
We have a number of really interesting projects in the works, and they're all based on the idea that bringing that unique culture of the American Northwest and of Oregon to life can be a lot of different things. And so, in particular, for example, we're working on 2 expressions of Westward that are collaborations with fellow producers in Oregon. One is going to be an Oregon stout cask finished Westward, and I'll sort of share a little bit about it in a minute. And then the other one is an Oregon Pinot Noir finish product, both of which we've already put in our tasting rooms in small quantities to just get some feedback from people who visit us, and both of which have performed sensationally. So we know these will be extensions to the brand within the next year. Stout cask will come first, and that really comes from a long tradition that we have of sharing barrels with breweries across Oregon. And the way it works is, we have a barrel of Westward that is mature and ready to bottle. We empty the barrel, bottle that whiskey. And then we'll give that barrel to a brewery to make their stout for that season. And so the barrel will leave us for 6 to 12 months, depending on the timeline for the brewery. They'll make their stout, they'll release it. We get to go to the party, it's fun. And then once their stout is released, they send the barrel back to us. Really? And then we fill it with mature Westward from a future barrel. And then leave it there somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And so in that additional time, we have a fully mature barrel of Westward that then gets this, really beautiful, amazing layer of flavor that is chocolatey and just delicious.
Oh, it sounds divine. Both the beer and the whiskey.
It's good. It's great. Yeah, it's better than good. And so we first launched this in Oregon in our home market this year, which we wanted a very controlled launch because we had no idea what % of our total business it was going to be. And it's really hard to plan production if you have no clue what's going to happen. And we're not fans of purposefully, running out of product to, get people excited when it comes back in stock. Like, hey, if you like our brand, you should be able to get it. And so we found that, even at a pretty significant price premium, it's 21% of brand volume. So that was really good in terms of, growing the brand. It was really bad in terms of supply, because that meant that if we're going to launch it in other markets, we needed more than we had at that moment. So it wasn't until the end of this year that we expanded that to New York and California in the U.S. And our plan is then to put Westward Stout Cask in the rest of our markets in the U.S. Early in 2020, and then to also make it available in the U.K. and in Australia. And so with that, it'll be in most of the markets where people can enjoy our flagship expression, and it'll live side by side with it. But it's a really wonderful product in its own right, and again, a celebration of one of the world's great brewing cultures in Oregon, and I mean, who doesn't like a nice stout? So it pairs very nicely with that too. And then Westward Oregon Pinot finish is, a similar story. It's a little less convoluted because barrels don't go back and forth as much. But Oregon is one of the world's premier Pinot Noir growing regions.
Of course, yeah.
And we have some really spectacular wineries, some of whom are good friends of ours. And so at harvest, we will take barrels that had been used for Pinot Noir, and then we fill them with mature Westward as well, give those anywhere between 6 to 9 months. And again, we get this delicious, wonderful additional complexity and flavor from the wine. That is a product that we want to have in the market by next year as well. That we have not sold in the U.S. yet, but we'll make it a concurrent world launch once it's available.
But you have to go to the distillery. So you have to go out to Portland to try it.
If somebody
and everyone should.
Yeah, if somebody, absolutely, everybody should come to the Westward Distillery in Portland. But even if you can't, we forgive you. It's not on the way to most places, but it is right in the center of a great city. If somebody can't make it out to visit us in the next year, we will eventually come visit you with. Westward American Single Malt, as well as the Oregon Stout Cask and Oregon Pinot Noir finished products.
Fantastic.
That makes me thirsty for a cocktail. So a big thank you to Tom for sharing his story. I can't wait to head out to Portland. But first, it's time for our cocktail of the week. We begin the year with a classic American cocktail with a French name, the Boulevardier. Think Negroni, but replace the gin with American whiskey. So we have sweet vermouth, Campari, and whiskey. Supposedly a man named Erskine Gwynn, an American, who whilst living in Paris in the 1920s, founded a magazine called Boulevardier. The authors published in his popular magazine drank as good as they could write. Hemingway, Joyce, and Noel Coward, to name just a few. Today, we have a take on the classic Boulevardier recipe from Will Meredith, head bartender of award-winning London bar Lioness. He calls it the Crystal Garden Boulevardier. He builds it with 3 ingredients in a glass with ice: 45 mLs of Westward Whiskey, 20 mLs of Basil Bitter, and 20 mLs of Peach Stone Aperitif. Stir, and then garnish with a grapefruit slice. To learn Will's inspiration for the cocktail and how to make the Basil Bitter and the Peach Stone Aperitif, you'll have to visit my website where you can find this recipe plus more whiskey recipes and all the cocktails of the week at alushlifemanual.com, where you'll also find all the ingredients in our shop. I don't know how they did it. Those 1920s writers like Hemingway and Joyce, how did they drink and then create? I'm happy to say that I will never know, as I am a 2-drink broad. 2 drinks, and I am under that table, and no one needs to ever be under that table. So although I'm not a dry Januaryer, I think it's good to check in with yourself every so often. If you live for Lush Life, would you consider supporting us by buying us a coffee? Just go to buymeacoffee.com/lushlife, and you can donate once or monthly to make sure we are still here every Tuesday. Our fabulous theme music for Lush Life is by Steven Shapiro and used with permission. And Lush Life is and always will be forever produced by Evo Terra and Simpler Media Productions. Which leaves me to reiterate the wise words of Oscar Wilde: all things in moderation, including moderation, and always drink responsibly. Okay, that second part was mine. Next week, we'll be here in London meeting with a man who went from paradise lost to paradise found on a cruise ship on the other side of the world. Until that time, bottoms up.